We're talking today, or I'm talking today, about the American artist Cy Twombly, who came to particular prevalence after the Second World War. And the fact that he references the Greco-Roman past is really well established. A lot of his paintings and sculptures carry the names of ancient places, ancient figures. Others still have the classical references scratched into the painting itself or the sculpture. And he pulls on a full massive breadth of textual references that are really interesting to read. But today I want to think about the material context, why these are being scratched in, what's the impact of them being scratched into the surface of paint. Another area that a lot of people have pulled out as a citation of his classical reception or his engagement with the classics is the fact that many of his paintings are made in a brilliant sort of bright white paint. And the artist himself once said that white paint was his marble. So there's this idea of how we receive classics, the big names, Alexander the Great, people like this that we know of, and the whiteness of marbles that we know of. But I want to think about how the artist's engaging with reception rather than reality, and remembrance and the act of remembrance in all of his work. And because of that, the visual and textual references to me have one common ground, and that's the material dimension of Twombly's work. The words are inscribed into a white paint and create what we're going to be talking about today as an epigraphic aesthetic, pulling on this idea of an inscriptional aesthetic particularly, and something that we have seen some of in Deirdre's talk already. Examining Twombly's work through an epigraphic lens allows us to rehabilitate the material dimension of both the textual and visual planes, and reframing the investigation in these terms helps us cast light on underlying themes that I've already mentioned that the artist is probing into, such as monumentality, ephemerality, remembrance. And then we can more thoroughly understand the breadth of references that the artist is making to the classical world, rather than simply relying on texts and explicit references to the Anabasis, for example, is one of the most famous of his paintings. So I want to start with the epigraphic aesthetic itself. So here we're looking at a painting from 1959. And although the inscriptional element is not as obvious as in some images that we'll look at later, there is a lot of elements that are quietly asserting an inscriptional quality. At first look, this painting, called Untitled Spelunga, seems no more than a series of doodles on cream paper and dashed with a painted spill. But on closer inspection, the haphazard illegible scrawls and graphite patterns all begin to look a bit more intentional. The pencil scrawls are both hasty and labored, with particularly dark and dense areas suggesting a tense embodied experience on the part of the artist, much more of attention than you would normally expect seeing something written on paper. The paint both covers pencil drawings and is covered itself by scrawling graphite, attesting a longer process of creation and adjustment than the image conveys on first look. Other than the date in the bottom left-hand corner, I don't know if anyone can make that out, the text is pretty much illegible. Any references to the Greco-Roman past, therefore, are not transferred textually, with the exception perhaps of the bracketed title that refers to the Italian coastal town where Twombly was staying at the time this image was produced, and which was also the site of the Villa of Tiberius, where magnificent marbles had been discovered only 2 years previously. If we move over to, yeah, there we go, a closer look at this painting. We can see that the artist's pencil at times cuts into wet paint, at times goes over dried paint. And you can see, I don't know if anyone can see my mouse, probably not, right? But you can see this tension between different layers of paint and pencil throughout. Phallic forms, for example, are scratched into the image in hasty lines, and these recall erotic graffiti found in the ancient world, all over Greece, Rome, Turkey, modern day anyway. A cursory investigation into ancient graffiti will return hundreds of examples of this kind of graffiti. And just a few examples from Smyrna already show the remarkable consistency between the ancient etchings and Untitled Spelunga. The weathering of its stone, its myriad textures and tones are echoed by the mixed material of the paint, paper, and graphite. The artist is establishing an intertemporal dialogue that reaches beyond the textual references to famed figures towards the material experience of the ancient past. And I think it's particularly interesting here where things are monochromatic in the same way that Twombly is producing his work. But Twombly doesn't limit his artistic interest and visual allusions to the ancient world to the brilliant white of highly acclaimed sculptures like the Elgin marbles, for example, since we were just talking about those. He's interested in the full breadth of ancient materiality, as we can see from what I think is a really startling similarity between these images on the board and this work on paper. He seems to have an affinity between his own art and the ancient low art, the things that we don't see in museums, that confounds the expectations of viewers who have been long conditioned to think of classical art as exactly the kind of stark white marbles housed in museums, particularly in the West today. One reviewer in the New York Times described Twombly's work as an exploration between the high and low, citing in particular the classics scratched on bathroom walls. But this view perpetuates the idea of classical sculptures as high art, something incongruous with bathroom walls. Twombly himself seems less inclined to draw such a distinction. Other reviewers of his work have been more receptive to the relevance of ancient graffiti. A 1979 article suggested that long residence in Rome has taught Twombly that a word niched, hope I've got that right, into architecture or cut into a freestanding wall can sum up a whole society. The Romans, ancient and modern alike, are champion graffitists. In many regards, Twombly's scribbles are a closer reflection of ancient art and aesthetics than the white paint commonly cited as evidence of his classicism. I do also very quickly want to note that while we're not talking about Basquiat today, it's very interesting to me that very few people talk about Basquiat's classicism beyond making reference to the fact that, oh, obviously it says Alexander the Great there. Obviously there are Roman numerals here. But the text that features heavily across his word is always in block capitals. It shares distinct similarities with epigraphic texts. And the visual similarities with other classical aesthetics as well, to me, are very obvious. I hope maybe some of you agree with me. The black, orange, and white on this painting in particular is so reminiscent of black figure painting, as is the fact that the figure's features are sort of scratched in a white paint incised. It's not unusual to see the discussion of Basquiat's images state that his influences are graffiti and primitivism. But primitivism is linked explicitly to African art in these reviews, and never to the ancient graffiti of Greece and Rome, despite the obvious similarities in many of Basquiat's drawing to those aesthetics. Returning now to Twombly, if my page will turn over, yeah, there we go. And in particular his sculptures, we see more blatant explorations of epigraphic norms and conventions than the first piece on paper. Tombstones are evidently a preoccupation of the artist, particularly in his later years, as are the inscriptions that they carry. The one we're looking at now, untitled In Memory of Babur, is comprised of 2 stacked wooden boxes coated in white plaster. There is minimal effort to refine the plaster coating, which is dried in an uneven texture, in places rough and in others smooth and even, as I'm sure you can see on the board. Around the corners, the plaster gathers in bulbous concentrations and therefore freezes the artist's movement in and over the wooden structure. The white plaster supposedly raises the status of the construction by linking it to a long tradition of marble sculptures, both ancient and in the neoclassical revival. The lower box carries the title of the image, In Memory of Babur, presumably referencing the founder of the Mughal Empire. The first 3 words we see are written onto the surface of dry plaster, but the capitalized letters of Babur have been incised onto a swipe of brilliant white paint. If again, my page will turn over. Yeah, there we go. The words are, sorry, the first three words are on the surface, and then this one, as we were just saying, has been incised into the paint. The surface texture of the paint, therefore, is visibly altered, and the visual and textual planes are rendered entirely codependent with the material. The words are congruous with the inscription epitaphs of stones, but materiality confounds this convention by placing the commemorative epitaph on a sculpture of found materials rather than monumental stone designed to last through the ages. And then we start to see a contrast between the idea of memory and inscription and longevity to the sort of disintegrating potential of these sculptures. The artist uses a familiar scrawl in cursive for the majority of this inscription, but memory is capitalized as if it were a name. The size and centrality as well of memory implies that the artist is probing and challenging how memories are preserved and what they mean. Rendering an epitaph in cursive also inverts the conventional block capitals of inscriptions, such as those we saw in the Basquiat piece, particularly of those found today. All of these considerations combined, the artist challenges the concepts of preservation and monumentality by inverting the expectations of inscriptions, and of familiar ones at that. Stone is replaced by plaster and paint, and the chisel becomes a pencil. The assertive rigidity of capitals are replaced by a variable mix of cursive and scratched misshapen capitals. Another sculpture of Twombly shares these preoccupations. This is another untitled piece in memory of Álvaro de Campos, and again is rooted in gravestone conventions. The uppermost piece is formed of a wooden board, plaster, and rises from a mound-shaped structure below. Plaster covers the entirety of the structure and again is unevenly applied. The tombstone on the top of the sculpture bears its title, where here we see only the day in cursive. Under a thin layer of plaster acting as a veil, the same inscription can be seen below, only this time it's entirely in cursive. Some have argued that the layering demonstrates the intent of remembrance. Layering one layer after the other suggests reiterating this remembrance through the material preservation of the artist's gestures. And while this may be the case, an epigraphic focus on the materials and text forms uncovers the multivalent nature of the artist's exploration of commemoration. The tension between the ephemeral materials and monumental form is unresolved, challenging the survival of the memory itself. The subject of the sculpture, Álvaro de Campos, refers to a heteronym, I'm struggling with words today, of the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, further confusing the role of memorializing structure, given that de Campos's own desires were simultaneously to be everything and to be totally isolated from all society, verging on nothingness. The artist appears to be questioning and challenging the desire to memorialize and to become something different, or to make someone something different, while simultaneously asserting an inevitable nothingness as all eventually degrades and dissolves. The aptly titled Epitaph of 1994 features a plywood box, again coated in plaster. There's something of a tradition here. But here the lid is held on an angle by plaster piling out of the box to tilt it up towards the viewer. It's inscribed with a fragment of Archilochus seen to the side of the image here, which hopefully you can all read. I've rendered it the same way as it's written on the text. Again, we see an unconventional use of letter forms as Twombly's challenging convention as much as he emulates them. The explicit classicism of the text reaffirms the epigraphic element as the artist plays with the concept of lasting memory through the overt association with tombstones. The reference to war dead might be more frequently associated with unmarked tombs, but here the artist is challenging that. Again, we have a tension between lasting and fleeting, really heightened by the fact that this fragmentary text of Archilochus has long survived any war memorials that he may have been referring to. As shown, Twombly's exploration of remembrance is tied to the interaction of material and textual while challenging the assumptions of both throughout all of these images. The 1991 sculpture Thermopylae epitomizes this trend. Here we're looking at the original sculpture, which was a wicker basket, which is then covered in plaster and resulted in a shape reminiscent of a burial mound. 4 plaster-coated tulips protrude from the top of the sculpture. The titles inscribed around the base of the mound, Thermopylae in 4 capital letters, which you can see here, and the text to the side from the modern Greek poet Kavafi, is written on the reverse and rendered in capitals too. So the poet Cavafy, obviously, evokes a Thermopylae and therefore obeys historical specification. The artist ties his Thermopylae to 480 BC, as the mound echoes the shape of a Corinthian helmet. But he also credits the modern poet with the text instead of looking to an ancient account of Thermopylae to inscribe his piece. Twombly subsequently produced 3 bronze casts of the sculptures, of which we're seeing one example, and thus integrated his work into an ancient tradition of highly prized bronze sculptures. The inscribed poem shares the same preoccupation with memories and afterlife. In producing multiples of his own Thermopylae, Twombly adds his version to countless other attempts, both literary and visual, at memorializing and reinventing the battle. In the bronze iterations, such as this one, the epigraphic elements are accentuated with a white patina that gathers in the incised letters. You can see in the image on the right here. Here, the artist explores the variables in inscriptional aesthetics in a new material. The bronze itself is closely associated with the tension between monumental and ephemeral. And now I'm going to have a really bad go at speaking some Latin as someone who can't speak a word of it. Exegge monumentum aere perennius, claimed Horace, I have built a monument more lasting than bronze. A poetic demonstration of the interontological conflict between literature, monument, text, and image in the pursuit of durability. Twombly engages with this tension by referencing a historical battle, but engages with remembrance rather than reality by drawing on this modern source. The blending of reception and reality is heightened by the fact that Cavafy avoids grounding his Thermopylae in 480. Twombly again deepens this tension by producing a material Thermopylae produced in both lasting and ephemeral materials, thus laying bare the conflict between each of these elements. A further irony can be found in the comparative ephemerality of many supposedly monumental works executed in metals, as the material can be easily recycled and reformed. Meanwhile, each of Twombly's works have gained a monumental status themselves, regardless of the material, by virtue of the modern museum context that they found themselves in. And now to talk about more general examples or more general themes across the artist's work. The white paint that is often invoked, as I've said, as evidence of Twombly's classicism is plagued with similar ironies. The white of ancient sculptures itself is evidence of the ephemerality of ancient materials and aesthetics, where polychromy remains only in small traces. We can't look at a white sculpture and think that we're looking at reality anymore. We have to know that we're looking at a received aesthetic. Plaster is similarly difficult to classify as a lasting or degrading material. Plaster casts of ancient sculptures have long been known to damage traces of polychromy, and therefore is far from innocent in this idea of what is received and what is real. The form may last, but the details are lost, and engendering a misshapen understanding of the past, even when faced with enduring relics. As such, the very concept of reality is challenged. Ostergaard aptly surmised that Twombly's work reflects classicism as it is in the popular imagination rather than as it was. But importantly, the artist seems to be conscious of this misremembrance. Rather than exalting the classics of the popular imagination, he challenges them, reintroducing supposedly low art forms of graffiti that have outlasted many monumental works, while simultaneously challenging the fetishization of white marble sculptures by rendering them in reclaimed and ephemeral materials with the veneer of classical whiteness. I hope you'll agree now, just to conclude, that close analysis of the epigraphic qualities of Cy Twombly's work, with close attention paid to text, its forms, the material that hosts text, offers a more comprehensive understanding of the artist's engagement with the classics, quote unquote. There are 2 fundamental points here. Firstly, that an epigraphic approach helps fuel analytical thought concerning materiality, while an epigraphic consciousness helps us comprehend the full range of intertemporal dialogue, allowing for a plurality of references that other analytical frameworks struggle to cover comprehensively. Angelos Chantirtis, again, sorry for the mispronunciation, concluded after the 13th Congress of Greek and Latin Epigraphy that epigraphy had demonstrated an ability to contribute to discourses applicable beyond the classics. As Twombly shares the modern epigrapher's concern with the combination of image and text, as well as the experience of material text, his work is a testament to the relevance of epigraphy itself beyond ancient monuments. Thank you.